The golden age of Irish-American boxing roughly lasted from 1870 to 1937. It was a dramatic time that captured the highlights of some of America's most successful Irish boxers. More importantly, the era also encapsulated the struggle of many Irish immigrants who were attempting to find an identity for themselves in American society. Irish people's need to craft a new identity and find a place of belonging in their new world led many to the sport of boxing. This would later become heavily intertwined with early 20th century Irish-American culture. However, what is often overlooked when studying this period is the exploitation of this Irish rags-to-riches image by many writers, boxing managers, and even directors of the time. Their use of this image was a selfish attempt to heighten their own careers. Figures such as Jack Dempsey and Raoul Walsh are at the forefront of this movement. Additionally, many of these false Irishmen further exasperated the Irish stereotype of violence, alcoholism, and stupidity, tainting the image of Irish boxers held as honest fighters within the ring. Many of these dishonest boxers will forever be remembered by their false portrayals and not by their true demeanours. In many cases, unfortunately, this was never truly exposed to the public, especially during their time. A controversial era starting with the powerful fighting styles of John L. Sullivan gaining his world heavyweight title in 1888 and finally ending with James J. Braddock, the last true Irish-American fighter who lost his world heavyweight title in 1937, thus ending the golden age of Irish-American boxing. During and after the famine years, Irish men and women were still coming to America in their droves. In addition, the number of Irish already living in America was massive. Many of these immigrants were residing in outright poverty on the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. Many found it difficult to gain employment. A census taken at the turn of the century in Boston shows that hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants were living in slums and were not much above the subsistence level. Most Irish who were employed stated their occupation to be either labourer or servant. Another issue for the Irish was their sheer lack of education. Most of them were illiterate and would have received very little schooling, if any. This all came together to create a situation of serious unemployment and poverty. The Irish comprised the highest proportion of the nation's paupers by the early 20th century. Even during the times of high employment in the American economy, working life was fraught with insecurity. One man during the period commented,
"Life in America was very trying on a person's nerves. There was always the fear that one might lose his position and become destitute, and destitution in America made life unbearable."
The high wages advertised to immigrant workers often failed to mention the high living costs of America. In addition, living during times of inflation or depression of the economy made the living standards virtually the same for many Irish as living in Ireland. Due to the combined disadvantages of being generally unskilled and poorly educated, the Irish were more vulnerable to racial discrimination, and they were often looked down upon as being stupid, lazy, violent, and alcoholic. At the turn of the century, the general image of Irish immigrant was in somewhat of a transitional period. One can garner a greater understanding of how society regarded the Irish through examining a comic strip by the cartoonist Frederick Burr, published on March 11, 1900, called Happy Hooligan. The image highlights the stereotypical views held by certain segments of society who believe the Irish to simply be alcoholic, homeless immigrants. However, this perception began to be challenged with the rise of Irish-American boxers, beginning with John L. Sullivan. Born in Boston in 1858 to Irish-American parents from Kerry and Westmeath, Sullivan was hardened by his childhood, as he spent most of his life in a rough, impoverished, and deprived inner-city Boston slum. During his youth, he was quickly given the nickname the Boston Strong Boy due to his great height and physical strength. He was arrested on numerous occasions for partaking in illegal fights. However, as his career went on, he began to distance himself from this illegal scene, becoming a legitimate professional. He transcended his thug-like image, gradually coming to be viewed as a great Irish-American athlete. Sullivan's image was initially as a boxer who depended on brute force and lacked technical skill. An opponent from the period commented on this, stating that
Sullivan knew nothing about boxing, but he was one of the most savage fighters and hardest hitters that ever lived.
Over time, he transformed this perception by showing his qualities as both an intelligent and successful competitor. Sullivan partook in some 450 fights during his career. However, many of these went undocumented. An official heavyweight boxing championship only began in 1882, but by 1888, Sullivan had gained his title as heavyweight champion and was well respected in his sport, to the point where John Boyle O'Reilly, an Irish poet, comments in the same year,
"Many people believe that his masterful quality lies in his vast physical strength. Nothing could be further from the truth. The superiority of Sullivan lies in his extraordinary nervous force and his altogether incomparable skill as a boxer.
Sullivan's boxing career as heavyweight champion ended on September 7, 1892, when he lost his title to fellow Irish-American James J. Corbett. The Irish immigrant at the turn of the 20th century effectively stood between two worlds within American society. Some had attained upward social mobility, becoming influential, while yet more still languished in abject poverty. Irish immigrants were the closest to being in while still being out. The Irish climb up the social ladder had come a long way in the previous years, but still needed to come a lot more. The success of these Irish-American boxers inspired generations of young Irish men to enter the sport. A path to success was revealed, a way to escape the poverty that many young Irish lived in. A large number of juveniles lacked any professional skills and had little hope of gaining employment beyond manual labour. However, boxing gave them confidence and an opportunity. The adolescent culture of the lower socioeconomic levels took to boxing very quickly. In these areas, the most successful boxers became pillars of their society and were regarded in high esteem. Boxers such as Sullivan and Corbett came to be very important role models to these boys, and it gave them something to aim for. In addition, many boxing coaches believed that the most successful boxers came from these slums. Over time, the sport of boxing grew popular amongst the American public, and so did the image of the Irish. The term "fighting Irish" was once used derogatorily, and portrayed them as wild and barbaric people. However, this term came to demonstrate the strength of the Irish athlete, eventually losing its negative connotations for many people. This era of sport represents a massive change in society's perception regarding the Irish immigrant. Stereotypes such as the Irish drunken brawler were being challenged by the champion Irish boxer. From 1909 to 1948, the Irish dominated the boxing circuit and were on average the most prominent ethnic group throughout the period. The reputation of the hyphenated American athlete had virtually overshadowed every other sportsman contending at the time. Boxing became permanently connected with the fighting Irish image. Further expanding on this point, Owen Cannon argues that
a succession of ethnic groups, roughly speaking, Irish to Jewish to Italian, dominate the sport while standing on the lower rungs of the economic ladder in its toughest neighbourhoods.
Irish surnames would continue to dominate the sport until Braddock's brief reign from 1935 to 1937, after which no Irish-American fighter would again become heavyweight champion. During this period, the image of the Irish would be elevated far beyond its racist and negative elements by fight posters, newspapers, and boxing magazines. After 1900, the second and third generations of Irish immigrants began to emerge in the boxing clubs around Boston and other American cities. One such boxer was Gene Tunney, who learned to fight growing up in New York. He was the son of two Irish immigrants who left Ireland from Mayo after the famine. He went on to win the heavyweight championship and hold this title from 1926 to 1928. Tunney defeated Jack Dempsey twice, first in 1926 and then again in 1927. Tunney was described as a tactical fighter and was even portrayed by one man as playing a game of chess in the ring. Due to Tunney's intelligence as a boxer, he often defeated opponents that used little else other than raw physical force to win their bouts. Other notable Irish-American boxers from this period include Mike Gibbons, Tommy Gibbons, and Patrick McFarland. All of these success stories became iconic with the American public. The romantic idea of a man going from rags to riches was intertwined with the image of the Irish boxer. An idealistic story of growing up in a working-class neighbourhood with nothing and climbing to the top through sheer physical endurance. Predictably, people came to exploit this story, and a flurry of books, films, and boxers came to use this image for personal gain. Writers such as Owen Frawley Kildare wrote biographies that delved into the lives of Irish-American boys growing up in slums. Some took this even further and entirely made up stories that exaggerated this variety of narrative, such as the director Raoul Walsh. While he did hold Irish-English roots himself, his major work, a film called Regeneration, released in 1915, horrendously played on the Irish Hiberno stereotype. The film about a young, uneducated Irish thug who indulged in a life of crime had very damaging effects to the Irish image, as during the period Irish ethnicity in boxing was praised. In 1929, a newspaper gave a report on upcoming boxing fights and outlined a description of the boxer's ethnic identity. For this reason, it was very easy for fighters to craft a character for themselves, regardless of its transparency. Usually this was a simple process of generating an Irish-sounding name, possibly from Irish links somewhere in their family, or even taking the name from an old boxer. In many cases, their ethnic identity was entirely fictional. One such heavyweight champion used the ring name Jack Sharkey to take his title in 1933. However, his Irish identity was completely false. His real name was Joseph Paul Zoukakis, and he was of a Lithuanian background. He took the name from an Irish boxer called Tom Sharkey, and American boxer Jack Dempsey. However, the most notorious of these fighters was Jack Dempsey himself, who actually took his boxing name from Jack Nonpareil Dempsey, an Irish-born boxer. Essentially, Jack fabricated his name and even his Irish identity. His Irish roots are incredibly disputed, and many historians, such as Owen Cannon, theorised that he did not actually have any Irish roots at all. One could contend that Dempsey's career was initially of benefit to the Irish image, by throwing off Irish fighting stereotypes. He was attractive, boasted a Hollywood smile, and his confidence pleased crowds. However, this soon fell apart, and his career and reputation began to spiral out of control. He lied to escape conscription to the American Army during the First World War, claiming that he was the sole supporter of his family. When crowds of his followers heard the news, they were outraged. In addition to receiving a torrent of penalties for his below-the-belt punches, he also received extreme dissatisfaction from the public for hitting his opponents in the head when their backs were turned or when rising from the ground. In 1923, the painter George Bellows attended a boxing match between Jack Dempsey and Louis Engel Firpo on an assignment for the New York Evening Journal. During this session, he made several drawings of the match and would later go on to paint one of his most iconic works called Dempsey and Firpo in 1924. The painting is incredibly dramatic, depicting the graphic scene famous in boxing history when Firpo lands a left hook, knocking Dempsey clean out of the ring and onto spectators. The crowd cheered this feat as many of them really wanted to see Dempsey lose. The picture shows the unpopularity of Dempsey during this period of his career. Firpo towers over his opponent in purple shorts. His legs and arms look like tree trunks, as his figure is sculptured in a stance of omnipotence. Dempsey, or the Manasseh Mauler, falls away from him, his skinny, elongated body hurtling through the air. George Plimpton, an American writer, describes the painting in 1995, contending that Dempsey looked like a beetle falling out of a tree. However, the painting is very overdramatic and does not accurately depict the fight. Despite Firpo's incredible attack on Dempsey that will go down in legend, Firpo actually went on to lose the fight. The entire match only lasted 4 minutes, and throughout its duration, the fight was dominated by Dempsey. The moment before the climatic scene took place, Firpo was being destroyed. In addition, what one could not predict by viewing the painting is that Dempsey climbed back into the ring after this and won the match. While the painting does not accurately show the outcome of the match, it does however correctly demonstrate the contempt the crowd and public held towards Dempsey. The dissatisfaction of boxing fans began to damage the image of Irish fighters and more generally Irish immigrants. By 1937, James J. Braddock was the last Irish American to hold a heavyweight champion belt. He was born to Irish immigrant parents in New York City. Braddock is a perfect example of the Irish American immigrant story. His childhood and most of his life was ridden with poverty. It was only through struggle and the desire to feed his family that he managed to become such a boxing legend. For this reason, he was immortalized into the 2005 film Cinderella Man. The movie in many ways exaggerates Braddock's story, such as the incredible brutish depiction of the boxer Max Baer. Braddock represents the closing chapter in Irish American boxing. His story is interesting for its portrayal of working class life, which was very representative of people during this period. However, what is more interesting is what his story symbolizes, a narrative type which many fighting legends, including Jack Dempsey and Jack Sharkey, attempted to steal due to its popularity. These men, along with the genuine Irish combatants that make up this era, are now crystallized in what has become known as the Golden Age of Irish American boxing.